Welcome. In this video, I want to go over some very basic CVP analysis problems just to kind of give us a general understanding of these formulas, how they work, how they can be manipulated based on different types of problems we might encounter in this class. So when we're taking a look at CVP, obviously one of the most important things is going to be the formulas. Now, usually I would say I am not going to write out the formulas. In past semesters, I was adamant I will not make a formula sheet for you. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go against that. I'm going to do that for this video, but simply just to kind of show you how you can kind of start getting an idea on how you can build your own for future chapters. A very important skill, whether you decide whether it's just to be successful in your future classes here at IRSC, or if it's for when you move on to your grad program, or if you ever do end up studying for some type of certification like CPA or CMA or an EA, it's very important to know how to take notes like this in ways that are going to be helpful for you. So off to this side here in Excel, bear with me, it's probably going to be a little slow, but I'm going to develop a little bit of a formula sheet that we can use to follow along. I'm not going to share the formula sheet with you, but you'll kind of see how you can start building something that you can use for reference, okay? Normally what I would say is if you're doing this, do it by hand. A lot of times doing it by hand is going to, for some reason, help you achieve that long-term mastery of a lot of these formulas, okay? So let's dig right in. Again, a lot of these are very basic. We're just kind of building off the core concepts and digging into these formulas piece by piece by piece. Okay. So let's start with the profit formula. The real profit formula that we usually end up seeing in this class, we're not really going to see until 1C. I just want to start with this first one, bare bones. A company has revenues of $500,000 and costs of $360,000. Calculate the company's operating profit. Now, one thing that I'm going to hope that everyone's very aware of is that costs are different from expenses. So here, when you are in cost accounting, you are going to usually see sales or revenues minus costs equals operating profit. I know this is very similar from the one that you learned in Theory 1. So revenues minus expenses equals net income, but it is not the same. Costs are different from expenses. Okay. So let's start with that. Just revenues minus costs equals operating profit. Now, when we take a look at our revenues and our costs here, we know that revenues are $500,000. Our costs are $360,000, which means that our operating profit, $140,000. Okay. Now we can dig into this a little bit deeper. The two main cost behaviors that we go over in cost accounting is variable cost and fixed cost. So when we look at this profit formula we have here, we can separate out our variable and our fixed costs. Right? So we can rewrite this formula to be revenues minus our variable costs minus our fixed costs equals operating profit. Now, once you start getting a lot more comfortable with these formulas, you can see that you can kind of shorten them. So like total revenues, usually we call these sales. So I'm going to say sales minus costs equals operating profit. Right? Same kind of idea here. Once you start getting more comfortable with the different things that we are learning in this class, you'll start seeing that you can shorten a lot of these in ways that you can almost trigger your photographic memories a little bit more. So sales minus variable cost minus fixed cost equals operating profit. Let me give us a little space there. There you go. Now, digging into this one here a little bit more, this kind of format might look a little, I would say probably the variables look kind of familiar to you. And by variables, I mean the revenues, the variable cost, fixed cost, and operating profit. Hopefully you remember seeing something like this when you were in your managerial accounting class. But one other way that I think that we should kind of be showing it is vertically, right? Basically the way that a statement would show this information. In financial accounting, we learn income statements, which are called absorption income statements. Now we're going to take a look at variable costing income statements. So under the profit formula area, because it still technically has to do with profits, I'm going to write out a variable costing income statement. So we have that visual. Okay, so our variable costing income statement, let's see, because now I feel like it has to be pretty. Okay, there you go. So when we're doing our variable costing income statement, this is going to start with our sales. The first thing we'll take out is our variable costs. And then sales minus variable costs will give us our contribution margin. Now we're going to talk a little bit more about contribution margin later, but essentially at this point we can say contribution margin is what's left over after we cover our variable costs in order for us to cover our fixed costs. And then whatever's left over from that generates a profit. It's hard to really understand what contribution margin means as a total, in my opinion. It usually makes a lot more sense on a per unit basis or as a percentage. So we will visit that a little bit later in this video. This is why I said it might take a little bit. It's a little bit slow and time consuming to write these out. All right. So back to 1B, it tells us that a company has revenues of 500,000. There's our S. Variable costs of 200,000. There's our V. And fixed costs of 160,000. Which again, this is the same company, so it's the same operating profit. We're just showing how these things can kind of get separated out. But we can actually separate out this profit formula even further. And this is the one for 1C, where we actually see what generally is shown as a profit formula in our text. So instead of having totals here, notice these are all capital letters. Instead of having totals, we can break this into per unit for a few of these. So I'm going to go straight to this version, thinking how I want to lay this out in a way that's going to be perfect. There we go. All right. So I'm not going to write it down individually, but essentially what it is instead of total sales, we're going to break it out into sales price per unit. So I'm going to use a little s times the number of units. That'll be X. So in this case, rather than automatically starting with total sales, we're saying, okay, well, what's the sales price per unit and how many units? Obviously, if we multiply together sales price per unit and total units, that'll give us total sales, right? So let's start with that. Our variable costs, little v, we are going to turn into variable cost per unit. And again, multiply by the number of units. And that would, if we went ahead and we multiplied those two, we would get total variable costs. And then fixed costs, those are generally given to you as a total. Keep in mind, kind of like what you've already learned in the past when it comes to these variable and fixed cost behaviors, variable cost per unit stays the same and total fixed costs stay the same as production changes. So I'm going to leave that as a big F and then big OP. All right. So bringing this back to 1C, we're going to be using that formula. Let me actually bring that over too so we can use that as a reference right above it. Okay. So sales price per unit is $50. I'll even do the little dollar sign so you can see there. Times 10,000 units. So sales price per unit is 50. They're selling 10,000 units in this example. Okay. So essentially, if we multiplied that 50 times that 10,000, we would see that total sales is $500,000. Very similar to what we were doing up here. Okay. Next, we need to minus out our variable costs. They don't give us total variable costs. So again, we're using that VX that we see here. So we need variable costs per unit. They give that to us as 20. Sorry, everyone. I'm talking around a mic. It's kind of hard to see my keyboard. There we go. All right, so $20 variable cost per unit. Again, 10,000 units. So this is where there's actually that relationship between sales price and variable cost, right? So variable costs and sales obviously both go up as we sell more units. So that's why it is linked directly to the same number of units. All right, now let's minus out our total fixed costs. Oh, I should do a total here first. Total variable cost, 20 times 10,000. Okay. And then same thing with the fixed costs. Again, those are totals, so that does not change. And now I just feel like I'm being repetitive with these two. But here we can see them broken out into the third version of our profit formula. And then here's us doing the math for it. So again, no change with our total operating profit. Same example, just digging into it a little deeper. All right. Now let's get into contribution margin. So contribution margin, I usually say that there are technically 3 contribution margins that you really need to be comfortable with to master our CVP analysis topics. So with contribution margin, I'm going to tell you, you guys just have to know how to find total contribution margin. And usually if they say, hey, just find contribution margin, most of the time they're referring to total contribution margin. So they won't always specify total. Just keep in mind. Kind of like here when we were doing our income statement, we wrote out just contribution margin. But if it's in this statement thing, we're talking about totals. So total contribution margin. Do it that way. Unit contribution margin, and this is simply contribution margin per unit. And then also contribution margin ratio. Okay. So let's go through each one individually. A company sells a product with a sales price per unit of $50 and a variable cost per unit of $20. What is the company's unit contribution margin? What does it mean? And if the company sells 10,000 units, what is the company's total contribution margin? So let's start with just the first part. They're asking us for unit contribution margin. So unit contribution margin, hopefully everyone kind of remembers these. Simply going to be our sales price per unit minus our variable cost per unit. And again, if we wanted to kind of get used to doing it in that way that we were doing above, sales price per unit minus variable cost per unit, little s minus little v. So in this case, that would be, sorry, I'm going to get better about doing these dollar signs here. 50 minus 20 equals 30. Okay. Now let's talk a little bit about what that means. That means every single time that I sell a good, $20 I know is going to be gone. That's just the cost of doing it. It's there. I have that cost. Every unit I sell, yeah, I'm getting $50 for it, but 20 of it is already getting used up by those continuous costs. They're there. They're going to be accrued every single, I shouldn't say accrued, accumulated every single time that we have a sale, right? So that means there's $30 left over. And that $30, let me give you the textbook way of saying it first. That $30 contribution margin is what we have to cover our fixed costs and then generate a profit. Okay. Now let's talk about this simply from a real world perspective. If I know that every time I sell a unit, $20 is already eaten up, that means that every time I sell a unit, $30 is left over. Once I cover all of my fixed costs, right? So let's say I had, let's keep it easy. Let's say I had $60 of fixed costs. Really unrealistic, I know. But let's say my fixed costs are only $60. That means that if I sell 2 units, I've covered my fixed costs. That means that every single unit I sell after that is $30 of profit, right? So that's why they say this contribution margin is what we have to cover our fixed costs and then generate a profit. Okay, so that's why our contribution margin can be very important for a company that is trying to really understand the big view about really how their company can be profitable and how really all of these different costs are interacting. So really, if we get back to our cost behavior discussion that we've had, it's so important for us to be very familiar and to be relatively careful when we are identifying our costs as variable or fixed. Okay. All right, let's do one more. If the company sells 10,000 units, what is the company's total contribution margin? We do have a formula for total contribution margin, which we're going to do in the next one. But just to kind of point this out, if 30,000 is our unit contribution margin and we have 10,000 units that we sell, that means our total contribution margin would then be $300,000. Okay. So that's one way of doing it. If you have unit and you have per unit and you have the number of units, you can simply multiply to find your total. Okay. Let's keep going here with 2B. A company has 500,000 in sales, 200,000 in variable costs. What is the company's total contribution margin? Let's start there. So the formula for total contribution margin, sales minus variable costs. And these are totals. So if we wanted to, we could rewrite this with our capital S minus our capital V. So total sales minus total variable costs. Let's take a look at it here. Total sales minus total variable costs. So total contribution margin of 300,000. Now, the second part of this is saying the company sells 10,000 units. What is the unit contribution margin? But rather than going back to what we learned before, where we convert each of these individually on a per unit basis, we technically could just take our total, divide it by the number of units to get our unit contribution margin of 30. So these last two, again, this is very basic. This is nothing near the complexity that we're going to be really kind of approaching a lot of these problems, but we're building a strong foundation so that when you see little tiny roadblocks like this in problems, you know, oh, I can just convert that to totals, or, oh, I can just convert that to per unit. Okay. So here we have per unit, we converted it to a total. Here we had a total, we converted it to a unit. All right, now let's talk about contribution margin ratios. So for contribution margin ratios, let's see what they give us here. Here they're giving us totals. So essentially what we're doing is, I'm going to assume now that you guys know your total contribution margins and your unit contribution margins. Okay, so let's go ahead and do our first formula for contribution margin ratio. And I believe I'm going to type it out. We'll make some space. So total sales minus variable costs, which is total variable costs. So if that looks familiar, contribution margin, by the way. Okay. And that would be divided by our sales. So again, if you need a little bit of a visual, S minus V divided by S. And this would be the same thing as if we said total contribution margin divided by sales. So it is genuinely the same thing. Move that over just one. Divide, there we go. So let's go back here. We see our formula is sales minus variable costs, also known as our total contribution margin, divided by sales. Let's do it. So sales minus our variable costs. Let's do that math first. Let's find our total contribution margin. So total contribution margin of 300,000. So there's our numerator. And divided by our total sales. Now, generally, this is given either in as a decimal or as a percentage. I usually prefer percentages. So let's pause here real quick. What does this mean? So when we see a contribution margin of 60%, it means 60% of every dollar that I sell is available to, again, cover my fixed costs and generate an operating profit, right? So 40%, which is technically the variable cost portion, 40% of my cost is already gone. Every time I sell a unit, 40% of every dollar I already know is going to be absorbed by those variable costs. It's just a fact. Then 60% is left over to cover my fixed costs. And then once I cover all of my fixed costs, I can then start generating a profit. Let's look at 2D. A company has a sales price of $50 per unit and a variable cost of $20 per unit. What is the company's contribution margin ratio? So we just learned total sales minus total variable cost divided by total sales. So what's my total sales? Okay, they don't give it to me. And but I know from before that I can convert my per unit into total sales by multiplying it by units. So where's my units? They don't give it to me. So here's where I want us to be very careful about the fact that there are two options. Now I don't like the way I did this. Give me a second. Let me play around with this a little bit. Then let's get rid of that. And now I can do this. Okay. So we have two options with the contribution margin ratio. We just saw it previously as a total, but we can also do it on a per unit basis. So instead of doing totals, we can do sales price per unit minus variable cost per unit divided by sales price per unit. Bear with me. Now I'm getting a little obsessive. I'm just going to delete this when I'm done. All right. So sales price per unit minus variable cost per unit divided by sales price per unit. So again, we're using with per units. So let's write this out in our other ways of seeing it. So sales price per unit, small s, minus variable cost per unit, small v, divided by sales price per unit, small s. And as you've probably already noticed, basically it's going to end up being unit contribution margin divided by sales. So sales minus variable cost, both per units, equals unit contribution margin. So really, if you know your unit contribution margin, this formula gets 10 times easier. So let's give that a go. $50. Yeah, let's do it in parentheses. $50 per unit minus $20 per unit. That gives us our unit contribution margin. I'm going to keep it all in the same formula for this one. Divided by $50 per unit, also 60%. So we're seeing here that whether it's a total or per unit, you can use either or, right? You're still going to get your percentage. Now, if we look at 2E though, a company has total sales of $500,000. And the company has variable costs variable cost per unit. There it is. Sorry, this is what happens when you do voice to text on a treadmill. Cost per unit of $20. Assuming that the company sells 10,000 units, what is the company's contribution margin ratio? Okay, so let's dig into this one. I need to find contribution margin ratio. I have my formulas. Now I'm saying, okay, company has total sales. Okay, so I can use totals. Let's start with that. Total sales, 500,000. And the company has variable costs of $20 per unit. So here's where we're running into an issue. They're giving us total sales and then variable costs per unit. Now, one thing that's very important to remember about the contribution margin ratio is that you can use totals, you can use per unit, but they have to stay consistent. So if I'm using total sales, I have to use total variable costs. So that $20, I'm going to have to convert that into totals by multiplying it by 10,000 units. So that means that my total variable costs are $200,000. Again, divided by $500,000, 60%. Okay. All right, hopefully we feel very comfortable with contribution margin now. Let's move on to break-even point. So there's two ways to really tackle break-even point. The first one is by using a formula. I'm going to focus on units first. Let's do the same way we did with break-even. Oh my goodness, break-even in units. Let's start there. Now this break-even in units, the formula is fixed costs, as a total by the way, divided by unit contribution margin. Okay. So with this first one, which if you want to rewrite, I'm going to rewrite it off to the side. Fixed costs divided by unit contribution margin. So a total divided by a per unit amount. So we have to be very careful here because now we're getting a little different, right? So let's take a look at this first one though. It tells us that a company has a sales price of $50 per unit and variable costs, and a variable cost of $20 per unit. If the company has total fixed costs of 160,000, how many units does the company have to sell to break even? So here's our break even in units, right? So 160,000 is our numerator, and then we have to divide it by the unit contribution margin. We already know what that is. We've done it several times now. So sales per unit minus variable cost per unit is going to give us a unit contribution margin of 30. I'm pretty sure this is a fairly ugly number. So let's do 160,000 divided by $30. Yeah, there it is. So notice here where it says, okay, so you have to sell 5,333 units and 0.33333, so a third of a unit. Obviously, we can't sell a third of a unit. So traditionally, we always say round up. So our answer would be 5,334 units. Now here's similar, but now they're saying how much in sales must they have in order to break even. So now we're going to get into the break even in dollars formula. So it's very similar to what we just did. So I'm going to actually copy and paste it. The only difference here is it's not divided by unit contribution margin. It's divided by your contribution margin ratio, which doesn't really matter if I capitalize or little it, because like we learned with the ratio, we can use all of our totals. We can use all of our per units. So fixed costs, same thing as what we did before, divided by our contribution margin ratio, right? So let's do that again. Contribution margin ratio, we can use our totals for sales and variable costs, or we can use our per unit. They give us per unit, so we will use per unit. Again, I know we already did this, but let's just do it over and over and over again to the point where these concepts are like second nature, right? So 160,000 divided by 60%. I'm going to do that math over here. $160,000 divided by 0.6 for 60%. Oops, my bad. There you go. So we need to have $266,666.67, right? I am always going to round up to the nearest cent, because again, this is in sales dollars, so I am going to round up to the nearest cent, which is 2 decimal places. There we go. Okay. So as long as they have that much in sales, they are good to go. Okay. Let's move on to target profit. And I'm actually going to cheat because I want to show you guys how similar target profit is to break-even point. All right, but now this is target profit. All right, the way that this is going to change is in the numerator, we add in target profit. And this is for both. That's it. Oh, I should change this to target profit, shouldn't I? But that's it. That's the only change that happens. Now let's talk about what do they mean by target profit. This whole time we've been talking about breaking even, right? Breaking even basically means our revenues equal our costs. We have zero profit. Now we're saying, okay, well, what if we want to make a little bit of money? What if we do have a target profit that we want to accomplish? How many units do we have to sell to cover our fixed costs and generate a little profit? So now we're covering fixed costs and getting our profit, right? So the only thing that changes is we add target profit in the numerator. So let's give that a try. Company has a sales price of 50, variable cost of 20, fixed cost of 160, and they want 50,000 in profit. Okay. So let's go ahead and start by finding our numerator. 160,000 in fixed costs plus they want to cover 50,000 in profit as well. And we're going to divide that by our unit contribution margin. I'm going to assume that by now we very easily know how to find that. So I'm just going to divide by the $30 unit contribution margin. Okay, let's do the math. $7,000 units. So if we sell 7,000 units, quite a bit above our break-even point, but okay, maybe depending on our industry, this is achievable, then we will generate a $50,000 profit. Okay. That's not too far off from that. That's awesome. All right, 4B. So this one is asking us for how much in sales do we have to have? Now, keep in mind, and this is the same thing for this other one, if we wanted to convert from units sold to sales dollars, technically all we needed to do was multiply the units by the sales price, right? Actually, let me show you that. So 5,334 times $50, 266, 700. The only reason we're off here is simply because of rounding. But if you were doing this for your own company and you just wanted a nice, quick, roundabout way of doing it, that's it. Same kind of idea here. And technically, we probably wouldn't run into any issues because this doesn't appear to have any rounding issues either. So let's go ahead and do the math, actually. 7,000 times 50. So based on this, we need $350,000 in sales in order to generate that $50,000 profit. Let's see. Let's do the full formula. So our formula is fixed cost plus target profit. I'm going to steal this. Fixed cost plus target profit divided by the contribution margin ratio. You already know what that is. It's 60%. And let's see what happens. Divided by 0.6, $350,000. So remember, we can always convert from units to totals, totals to units. The only times we have to really be careful is this one up here where it's an ugly number and we had to do some type of weird rounding up. Okay. Last concept, margin of safety. Okay. So margin of safety is basically saying, based on our current level of sales, how safe are we as far as staying in the green, generating profit? So basically, how close are we to break even? Okay. So the formula for margin of safety, let me do this, margin of safety in units is literally actual unit sales minus break-even unit sales. So let's take a look here. We have a company with a sales price of $50 per unit and variable cost of $10 per unit. If the company has fixed costs of 160,000, what is the company's margin of safety in units if they sell 10,000 units? Okay. So I know we already calculated our break even in units, but I want to do it again simply because I think it's good practice, but I'm going to go up here to kind of steal my math. Okay. So our formula for, actually, let's break it down. Actual unit sales minus, can't see, can you? Break even unit sales. Okay. So actual unit sales. Here they're telling us, hey, we sell 10,000 units. That's our actual unit sales. Our break-even unit sales, let's solve for that real quick. So break-even unit sales, we need to grab our fixed costs. And we need to divide it by the unit contribution margin. Which, let's see, oh, well, technically kind of changed. Give me a second. These are supposed to say 20, by the way. 2020. There we go. So here, no, I just have to check. Yeah, 20. These are supposed to say 20. Same company, same example. All right, so here, 50 minus 20, that's $30. And again, if we did the math, that would end up being our, what was that, 5,334? 5,334 break-even units. Okay. So again, we have 10,000 actual unit sales. Our break-even units, so in order to break even, we would have to sell 5,334 units. So our margin of safety, right, how close we are to our break-even and to kind of getting into the red would be, I know I should do this math in my head, but I'm sleepy. 10,000 minus 5,334, 4,666. Perfect. Oh, bad. That's not in dollars, that's units. Let me bold it because that's our answer. This one here is just for this. There you go. So essentially, we are 4,666 units above our break-even point. So depending on your company, you might feel fairly safe. We really would have to dig into how well that company does on a regular basis. Let's do another one. Margin of safety in dollars. Let's say sales dollars. Keep it consistent. All right, so actual sales, and these are total sales, by the way, minus break-even sales. So again, very similar to when we did it in units. So let's see. Margin of safety in dollars with this. All right, so do they give us total sales outright? They do not, but you've done this enough. You know how to find total sales, right? So hopefully you've paused this. I did it again, goodness. Hopefully you can pause this and you can attempt it first to find it because this is the first time you actually get to do it on your own. But here, I'll go ahead and get started. Sales price per unit is $50. We have 10,000 units. That is total actual sales of $500,000. Now from there, we have to minus out our break-even sales. Again, I'm going to pretend that I don't know what this is. So let's do the math. $160,000. Divided by our contribution margin ratio. And that was 266,666.67. Let's plug that in. All right, and when we do that math, we say, okay, well, how far above are we? 500,000 minus 266,666.67. $233,333.33. Okay. And let's actually write that out. Margin of safety in sales dollars. So our sales are $233,333.33 above our break-even point. Good. The only other one that isn't technically here that, maybe you should know is margin of safety as a percentage. But essentially it is these formulas here, either in totals or in units, divided by actual unit sales, or for over here, actual sales. So it's very similar to our contribution margin ratio for doing a percentage, right? Either it can be units or it can be sales. We just have to divide by sales. Just keep it consistent. All right, so I hope that with this intro, we are going to have no problems once we get into the more complex versions. Keep in mind, the problems that we're going to see for cost accounting are going to be much more challenging than this. They're going to ask you to combine many things. For example, instead of telling you variable cost is $20 per unit, they might give you several costs and you have to decide what is variable cost, right? So just keep that in mind. You're going to need to know these formulas like the back of your hand, okay? So keep up the good work. I'll see you next class, and happy studying. Have a good one.